The funeral was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a room when people are grieving, but also, if you looked carefully, relieved. 81-year-old Dorothy Hale had not been an easy woman to love. Her 3 children sat in the front row, her son Richard, stiff-backed and expressionless, her daughter Carol, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she hadn't needed yet, her youngest Paul, checking his phone under the pew when he thought no one was looking. The pastor spoke about grace, about a life well lived, and then something happened that no one in that room would forget. Dorothy's neighbor, a quiet woman named Iris who had lived next door for 22 years, looked at the closed casket and smiled. Not a sad smile, not a polite smile, a knowing smile, the kind that meant something. 3 days later, when the family gathered for the reading of the will, they finally understood why. Stay with me, because Dorothy had been planning this for a very long time. Dorothy Hale had outlived 2 husbands, 1 sibling, and the patience of nearly everyone who knew her. She was sharp, difficult, precise. She remembered everything, every slight, every broken promise, every Sunday that passed without a phone call, and she filed it away with the quiet efficiency of someone who intended to use it someday. Her children had learned over the years to manage her carefully. Richard called every 2 weeks, birthdays, holidays, never more than necessary. Carol visited 4 times a year, Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, and Dorothy's birthday, with her husband and 2 children in tow, smiling tightly and counting the hours until she could leave. Paul called when he needed money, which was often. Dorothy always gave it. She never mentioned it afterward. She didn't need to. He knew she remembered. This was the arrangement, functional, cold, built on obligation rather than love. Dorothy had watched it develop over 30 years and said nothing. She had simply kept notes. If you already have a feeling Dorothy was not going to let this go quietly, you're right. Hit that like button and stay with me, because what she left behind wasn't just money. Iris Beaumont had moved in next door 22 years ago. 6 months after Dorothy's second husband passed. She was 63 at the time, a retired schoolteacher, widowed herself, quiet in the way that comes from a life spent listening rather than talking. She brought soup the first week. Dorothy, who had turned away casseroles and condolence cards from everyone else, accepted it without comment and ate it standing over the kitchen sink. Iris came back the following week, and the week after that, not with soup every time, sometimes with nothing at all. Just a knock on the door and the offer of company. Dorothy never said thank you, not in words, but she always opened the door. Over 22 years, an arrangement developed between them that neither woman would have called friendship, but which functioned, in every meaningful way, as exactly that. They watched television together on Thursday evenings. They disagreed about everything: politics, religion, the correct way to make pie crust, and argued with a comfortable ferocity that suggested deep, mutual respect. When Dorothy's health began to decline 3 years ago, it was Iris who drove her to appointments, Iris who picked up prescriptions, Iris who sat in the waiting room for 4 hours during Dorothy's hip surgery without being asked. Dorothy's children sent flowers, Iris brought lunch. Dorothy noticed the difference. She noticed everything. The decline was gradual and then sudden, the way these things always are. In the final year, Dorothy rarely left her bedroom. She slept more, ate less. The sharpness in her eyes dimmed on some days and blazed on others with an intensity that made the visiting nurse uncomfortable. She asked for a lawyer in September, not her family's lawyer, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled Dorothy's affairs for 15 years and who Richard considered, essentially, a family ally, a different lawyer, one she had found herself. A woman named Sandra Oakes, who drove 40 minutes from the city and spent 3 separate afternoons with Dorothy, door closed, voice low. Richard asked once what the meetings were about. Dorothy looked at him steadily. "My affairs," she said. He didn't ask again. 3 meetings with a lawyer no one knew. A door always closed. And Dorothy smiling at things no one else could see. Subscribe now, because the reading of that will was unlike anything that family had ever experienced. Dorothy died on a Tuesday morning in November, peacefully, the nurse said, in her sleep. Iris, who had stayed the night in the guest room at Dorothy's request, something she had been doing more frequently in the final weeks, heard nothing. She made coffee at 6 a.m. and knocked on Dorothy's door at 6:30 and knew immediately, from the quality of the silence, what she would find. She called the ambulance. Then she called Richard. Richard arrived 2 hours later. Carol, 20 minutes after that. Paul, who had to drive from 3 states away, the following morning. They moved through the house with the careful efficiency of people cataloging an inheritance. Iris stayed out of their way. She sat in the kitchen and drank tea and said very little. Carol asked once if Dorothy had said anything in her final days, anything important. Iris wrapped both hands around her mug. "She said a great many things," she answered. "She usually did." The funeral was held 5 days later. It was a small service. Dorothy had specified, in writing, that she wanted no reception, no gathering at the house afterward, and no eulogies longer than 3 minutes. The pastor had been given a single index card with approved talking points. This was so thoroughly Dorothy that even Richard almost smiled. Almost. The children sat in the front row and performed grief with varying degrees of convincingness. Iris sat 3 rows back, alone, in a navy blue coat Dorothy had always said suited her. And at some point during the service, during the reading of a psalm Dorothy had selected herself, which contained, Iris knew, a line that would have meant something specific to Dorothy and nothing to anyone else in the room, Iris smiled. She couldn't help it. She knew what was coming. Richard saw it. His eyes narrowed. He filed it away for later. That smile. Richard saw it, and for 3 days, it ate at him. Then Sandra Oakes walked into the room with a sealed envelope, and everything Dorothy had been planning for 3 years finally came to light. Keep watching. Sandra Oakes arrived at the house on Friday morning. She was brisk and professional, and entirely unmoved by the weight of the room. She set her briefcase on the dining room table, the same table where Dorothy had eaten 30 years of meals, hosted 20 years of obligatory holiday dinners, and conducted, according to Carol, the most stressful Christmases of her childhood, and she removed a document and read it without preamble. The house to be sold. The proceeds divided equally 3 ways among Richard, Carol, and Paul. There were murmurs of acknowledgement. This was expected. The savings account, which everyone assumed was the significant asset, contained, Sandra Oakes reported, $11,000. Silence. Richard did the math quickly. He had been expecting considerably more. Is that all? Carol asked. Sandra Oakes looked up briefly. From the savings account? Yes. She continued reading. Dorothy's jewelry. Specific pieces assigned to specific people with specific notes attached. A ring to Carol with a card that read, in Dorothy's handwriting, "You always admired this. I noticed that you never asked for it. That meant something to me." Carol's eyes filled for the first time. A watch to Paul with a card that read, "Stop selling things that matter for things that don't." Paul said nothing. His jaw tightened. A set of first edition books to Richard with a card that read, "You have your father's intelligence. You chose not to use it on the people who needed it. I hope you reconsider." Richard set the card face down on the table. Then Sandra Oakes reached the final section. Dorothy had, it emerged, a second account, an investment account opened quietly 11 years ago, managed without the knowledge of her family or her previous lawyer, containing, Sandra Oakes stated the figure without inflection, $462,000. The room went very still. $462,000. Richard's head came up sharply. "And the beneficiary?" Carol whispered. Sandra Oakes looked up. "The entirety of the account," she said, "is left to Iris Beaumont, with the following note." She unfolded a separate card. She read it aloud. "Iris, you brought soup when no one else came. You stayed when everyone else managed me from a distance. You argued with me honestly and never told me what I wanted to hear. You were the only person in my life who treated me like a person rather than an obligation. This is not charity. This is a debt I owe you, and I have never in my life left a debt unpaid. Use it well." Dorothy. The silence lasted a long time. Paul was the first to speak. "That's not, she can't, she can," Sandra Oakes said simply. "She did." Richard stood up from the table and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to the room for a very long moment. Carol looked at the ring on the table in front of her, picked it up, held it. She thought about 30 years of 4 times a year visits, of tight smiles and counted hours, and the low-grade guilt that had followed her home every time, of every phone call she had almost made and hadn't, of every moment she had chosen distance because closeness felt like too much work. She thought about a retired schoolteacher who had knocked on Dorothy's door 22 years ago with a pot of soup, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say. Dorothy had been keeping score her entire life, and she had been absolutely right. Iris donated $40,000 to the local library the following spring, the same library where Dorothy had spent every Tuesday afternoon for 15 years, reading in the chair by the window, speaking to no one. She kept the rest. She did not feel guilty about this. Dorothy had been very clear, in their final weeks together, that guilt was an emotion for people who hadn't paid attention. Iris had paid attention. She always had. On the first Thursday after Dorothy died, Iris sat alone in her own living room at the time they would have watched television together. She didn't turn it on. She sat in the quiet and thought about 22 years of soup and arguments and Thursday evenings, and a woman who had been difficult and exacting and completely impossible to manage, and she smiled. The same smile she had smiled at the funeral. The one no one had understood until now. Dorothy spent 30 years watching, measuring, remembering, and in the end, she gave everything to the one person who never needed to be asked. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Tell me, do you have a Dorothy in your life? Or an Iris? And if you want more stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark, subscribe. New story every week. I'll see you in the next one.